Is American English something that crosses boundaries of region, that crosses boundaries of class and culture? Or is American English, in effect, the sum of its regional forms? In my last lecture, I tried to identify some of the features of American regional dialects and call attention to the way in which original settlement patterns spawned or developed different dialect areas. I also called attention to the way in which some of the resources of contemporary dialectology and lexicography, notably the Dictionary of American Regional English, still explicitly ground their projects in the 19th century debates about national and linguistic identity and also about the relationship between amateur desire, the ardent fascination with language on the one hand, and the need to create a systematic historical methodology on the other. In this lecture, I'd like to develop some of those issues by looking at the literary representation of American dialects, and I'm going to try to read a few passages in American regional dialects. I'm going to call attention to vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, and I'm going to call attention to some issues as well of pronunciation. But what I want to stress here is that I am trying very hard not to caricature speech, even though some of these literary representations may be caricatures, and even though they may be written by individuals who were not themselves members of the regional or the ethnic or the class speech community they represent, nonetheless, their literary representations may provide us with evidence for the historical pronunciation and the historical grammar of certain regions in America. They may provide us with evidence for the survival of certain forms of folk speech or folk idiom in American culture. And they also provide us with examples of narrative. And the thing that I want to stress is that regional or folk speech is not simply the sum of funny words or strange pronunciations. It is a form of narrative. It is a way of telling a story. And so what I'll be stressing here are the ways in which American regional experience tells a story. Now, in representing dialect in literature, we come across another example of an issue I've been talking about throughout this course, and that is dialect. How do we create the impression or evoke the illusion of someone speaking non-standard English? We may write says, S-E-Z, for S-A-Y-S, and the pronunciation of says and says may be actually identical. But by writing S-E-Z, or by writing W-A-N-N-A for wanna, or G-O-N-N-A for gonna, even though these may be the ways in which most people pronounce want to and going to. I'm going to do this. We don't think of this as necessarily uneducated or dialectical. These forms of dialect, these kinds of spellings, are designed to evoke regional affiliation or level of literacy or level of class. In other words, what's being evoked is how the individual might write the word were that individual to write says, let's say. There's a wonderful example in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, when the Duke and the Dauphin are putting on Hamlet. And Huck asks if there are going to be any encores. And the word encores is spelled not E-N-C-O-R-E-S, but O-N-K-O-R-E-S, encores. Now, when you say encores and you say encores, regardless of how it's spelled, it may be the same thing. But the idea is to evoke, by using a particular spelling, the unusualness of the word or the way in which it is pronounced or stressed. In other words, are there going to be any encores? As if I want you to know that I know this high concept or francophone word. So the issue of I dialect is central to the problem of literary representation, and in mentioning Twain, I call attention to probably the most famous figure in the literary representation of dialect in America. He's best known for his attempts in books like Huckleberry Finn to try to represent accurately and sympathetically the language of Missouri, white and African American speech in the middle of the 19th century. Now, Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn in particular, from which I will be drawing, is set in the 1840s, but it's written a generation later. And Twain is no longer living in the Missouri of his childhood. Twain, in mature life, lived in Elmira, New York. He lived in Hartford, Connecticut. Twain is ensconced in the American Northeast establishment. And so there is an issue also in the representation of dialect that is very keyed to the issue of nostalgia. And I want to stress this. In other words, in looking at dialect, are we going back not simply to something that is original or authentic in America? Are we going back, in effect, to the childhood of America? Does regional dialect stand to standard English as childhood speech stands to adult speech? And therefore, when writers go back to set works in the time of their childhood, are they doing so to create the impression that their characters, in a sense, are not simply children, but that the speech of the time and place is somehow immature on the one hand, or perhaps more authentic and felt on the other hand? I'm going to do my best with Twain. And here's a moment in Huckleberry Finn where Tom says, I know how to fix it. We've got to have a rock for the coat of arms and mournful inscriptions, and we can kill two birds with that same rock. There's a gaudy big grindstone down at the mill, and we'll smooch it and carve the thing on it and file out the pens and the saw on it too. Now, I've read this lightly because there's almost no I dialect in Tom's speech. But when Huck, who is the narrator, speaks and writes, there is an enormous amount of I dialect. It weren't no slouch of an idea, and it weren't no slouch of a grindstone nother. But we allowed we'd tackle it. Weren't quite midnight yet, so we cleared out for the mill, leaving Jim at work. We smooched the grindstone and set out to roll her home, but it was a most nation-tough job. Sometimes do what we could. We couldn't keep her from falling over. And she come mighty near mashing us every time. Tom said she was going to get one of us sure before we got through. We got her halfway, and then we was plumb played out, and most drowned with sweat. We see it warn't no use. We got to go and fetch Jim. So he raised up his bed and slid the chain off of the bed leg and wrapped it round and round his neck. And we crawled out through our hole and down there, and Jim and me laid into that grindstone and walked her along like nothing. And Tom superintended. He could out-superintend any boy I ever see. He knowed how to do everything. I think that this is Huck's speech. Now, what I've tried to do is call attention not just to particular sounds, but to particular grammatical issues. And as I stressed, when Huck writes or speaks, there's more I dialect than when Tom does. So it seems clear that Twain wants to represent Huck's speech either more accurately on the one hand or more regionally on the other. So what do we see in this passage? We see spellings like W-A-R-N apostrophe T. We see N-O-T-H-E-R. We see W-R-A-P-T. Warn't, nother, wrapped. This is pure I dialect, and it is designed not to transcribe phonetically the sound of speech. It is designed to evoke the flavor of pronunciation. When we talk about morphology, that is, the way in which the forms of words are represented to indicate grammatical distinction, we can see a characteristic of regional or folk speech in words like drowned and knowed. We see the multiple past instead of the participial form, drowned and known. In the course of the narrative I read as well, we can see something that is characteristic of folk or regional narration, and that is an oscillation or a variation between telling a story as something that happened in the past and telling a story as something that is happening in the present. So if you go through a passage like this and you look at the tenses of the verbs, what you'll see is that some of them are in the past tense. Cleared out, smooched the grindstone, we couldn't keep her, Tom said, we was plumb. And then, on occasion, there is a present tense. We see it weren't no use. We got to go. And this kind of oscillation between the present and the past is, I think, characteristic of folk narration. So I says to my son, Aaron, I says, and here is an example again of the way in which we narrate in the present. What's also interesting is the vocabulary. Words like smooch, meaning to steal, or nation tough job. This is a euphemism. A euphemism is the use of an elaborate or heightened word or phrase to cover up a potentially offensive or obscene form. Now, what's very interesting is the way in which nation becomes a regional euphemism. You have a damn tough job. You have a damnation tough job, and therefore you have a nation tough job. Plumb played out. These are the landmarks of regionalism here. And what's also interesting is the way in which hypercorrection can be the landmark of regionalism. That is, one of the things that's very interesting about the passage is the way in which, in Huck's voice, you have this regional, local, folk vocabulary, and then you have something exceedingly learned, and that is superintended. Tom superintended. What Huck does is he uses this word, and then his narration becomes exceedingly self-conscious about it. In other words, it's almost as if he is surprised to hear that word in his mouth or coming from his pen, because it is a learned term. And so what he wants to do is use it in a kind of hypercorrect form. That is, use it in a way that makes a new word so that it seems as if Huck is genuinely learned. And so he out-superintended any boy I ever see. And this combination of out-superintended as a kind of nonce or coinage, and I ever see instead of I ever saw, the return to a folk regional narrative present. He knowed how to do everything. This collocation of grammatical terms brings out the uniqueness of the nonce term out-superintended, and it contributes to the regional flavor, I think, more than any form of pronunciation for Twain. Another important writer of the 19th century who is best known for his representation of regional English is Joel Chandler Harris in his Uncle Remus stories. And he seeks to represent the language and the culture of the African-American slaves of the mid-19th century, in particular the Piedmont district, but also there are some aspects of his writing that point to regional speech and forms and idioms further south around the banks of the Mississippi. And here is a passage from A Run of Luck. And I want to look at this for its representation of this version of African-American speech. In a subsequent lecture, I'm going to go into some detail about the history and features of African-American English. And I want to stress here that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to recreate the sounds and forms of speech that Chandler Harris is illustrating with his I dialect. And so it goes something like this. "Well, sir," he said after a while, "I come mighty and I gwine off with my young marster. I spec I'd have gone off he'd had any chillun, but he ain't had a blessed one. And it looked like ter me, such, that of the Lord gwine to stand by a man. He gwine to give him chillin. But that ain't all, sir. I done been out ter Mississippi with my young master, and at one time was too much for me. First, there was the rippet on the steamboat, and then there was the burning of the boat, and then come the swamps, and then the canebrakes. And I tell you right now, sir, I don't know which was worse, the rippet on the boat, or the fire, or the swamps, or the canebrakes. That ain't no country like ours, sir. There's enough water in the state of Mississippi for to float Noah's Ark. It's in the very land what they plant the cotton in, sir. The ground is mushy and black. You mayn't believe me, sir, but there was times when I was out there that I'd have paid 7 pence for to get a whiff of dish of red dust up my nose. When you come to farming, sir, give me the red line or the gray. It may not make as much cotton in one season, but it lasts longer, and it's lots more wholesome. So what is characteristic of the speech that Joel Chandler Harris is trying to evoke here by using particular spelling forms? What is characteristic is the dropping of the final R sound. And so sir is spelled S-U-H. So you get not only the lack of the R, sir instead of sir, but you also in the U form, in the U spelling, you get a lowering of the vowel, sir instead of sir. But you have the intrusion of R in a word like marster, which is spelled M-A-R-S-T-E-R instead of master. You see various grammatical forms that scholars have subsequently recognized as characteristic of African American English. This is what we might call the use of the durative in the phrase I done been. Now, this is, as I will call attention to us in a subsequent lecture, not an issue of ungrammatical or illiterate speech, but it is something perfectly consonant with the grammar of African American English, which uses durative aspects rather than tenses. In other words, it calls attention, using done been, to actions that are ongoing. And I'm going to call attention to this in greater detail in my lecture on African American English. The thing I want to stress now is that this is an evocation of a grammatical feature of a language rather than an evocation of illiteracy. In other forms, Mississippi is reduced to Marsissip. The TH sound is consistently written as D, so instead of there and them, there, and dem. And occasionally you have phrases where the G is dropped. So instead of burning, you have burnin', for example. Now, it seems to me that what is also fascinating about a passage like this is not simply the pronunciation or the grammar, but the vocabulary. And there seems to be a word in this passage which exemplifies to me the nature of this problem of vocabulary, and that's the word canebrake. That is, that in this particular swamp, there are canebrakes. And canebrake is a word that shows up, if you look it up in the DARE, as early as 1770. It's in an 1810 and an 1836 quotation. It appears in DARE well into the 1970s. And what it makes clear is that the canebrake is a particular kind of vegetation growing on the banks of the Mississippi in a certain area. In other words, that this is a particular local word that's designed to evoke a very special time and place, but also that this is a word that fits into the narrative spectrum of Chandler Harris's African American way of telling a story. And that is the feature of narration here. This is a story, if you follow it through, this is a story about disaster on a river. Well, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn has a story about disaster on a river. But now the allusions make it very, very different, because there's enough water in the state of Mississippi for to float Noah's Ark. Now, as soon as you make the association that there's enough water in the state of Mississippi to float Noah's Ark, what you're doing is you are associating your story with biblical narrative. And you are giving this story now not simply the flavor of folk narration, but the flavor of pulpit oratory, that this is in effect a sermon. And the nature of the sermon is to bring us back, as we saw in Frederick Douglass's story of the runaway slave, to the ways in which the African American experience is so frequently an experience of alienation, an experience of being lost, that the swamp or the river or the disasters that are represented here are figures for the swamp in which the African American experience in the 19th century was represented. And the language here is so much a language of the story of the African American slave. The ground is mushy. The ground is mushy. The ground is always mushy. When we deal with American region, dialect, race, and class, and we should not let ourselves be swamped by these details or by the fear of caricature in our discussion. Now, when we move north and we look at a couple of passages that are representative of different regions in American English, we might turn to the late 19th century Maine writer, Sarah Orne Jewett. In her story, Andrew's Fortune, she illustrates the literary representation of the Eastern New England dialect, the so-called Downeaster form of Maine. And you have a poor couple discussing here. "We was dreadful concerned to hear Cousin Stephen's death," said the poor man. "He went very sudden, didn't he? Great loss he is." And Betsy says, "Yes, he was very much looked up to, too." And it was some time before the heir plucked up courage to speak again. And he says, "Wife and me was lotting on getting over to the funeral, but it's a great way for her to ride. And it was perishing day that day. She'd been troubled more than common with her physic since the cold weather come. I was all crippled up with the rheumatism. We want neither of us fit to be out. 'Twas all I could do to get out the barn to feed the stock while Jonas and Tim was gone. My boys was over. I suppose you know. I don't know they's come to speak with you. They're backward with strangers, but they're good, steady fellows." "Them was the louts that was hanging around the barn, I guess," said Betsy to herself. "They're the mainstay now. They're ahead of poor May already. Jonas, he's got a rising $100 laid up. And I believe Tim's got something too. He's younger, you know." So Jewett uses I dialect to indicate the characteristic vowels of the Maine down east. So she spells great, G-R-E', great. And stiddy, S-T-I-D-D-Y, is steady. In addition to this, there are several words, there are several vocabulary terms that locate the speaker as a member of a class as well as a region. For example, the use of such apparently ungrammatical expressions as dreadful concerned or my boys was over. But my favorite, just as canebrake is my favorite representation, my emblem, if you like, of the language of Joel Chandler Harris, my favorite here is physic, and it's spelled P-H-T-H-I-S-I-C. It is a physical ailment. Now, what is physic? If you go to the Dictionary of American Regional English, as I will do right now, and you look up physic, what you get is any of a variety of conditions producing coughing or difficulty in breathing, especially asthma. Rarely uses the name of an imaginary illness, hence physicky, affected by such a condition, asthmatic or wheezy. And it is attested as early as 1806. Now, it's quite clear that physic is a not just dialect term, but a very technical regional term. And this spelling, P-H-T-H, is designed to evoke the spelling of a technical ailment from Greek science. That is the way in which science coins words on Greek models. So there is an element of the pseudoscientifically Greek in here. But there's a fascinating entry from the DARE from 1975. And here's the quotation that they give from an author who's writing about the Maine language. And the author says that physic is sometimes spelled physic. It's included here because somebody who didn't know how to spell it suggested it was a good Maine word. Physic is in any good dictionary. Its peculiar orthography made it a favorite in old-time spelling bees, and until spelling bees went out of style, almost all Mainers could spell physic. Now you get a wonderful sense here that the idea is that this is a word that sort of lives in the spelling bee. It's a trick word. It's a main word. It's a dictionary word. Physic is in any good dictionary. Go back to the phrase good dictionary. Remember when I read that selection from Webster's Ninth, a good dictionary. What is a good dictionary? The mark of a good dictionary can be many things. Is the mark of a good dictionary one that has the word physic in it, spelled correctly? Now, I want to read one more passage and then summarize some of the issues that I'm trying to raise here. And the passage I'm going to read is from Marjorie Kinman Rawlings' My Friend Mo. And this is the evocation of the cracker speech. And I'm not going to stress the pronunciation as much in this, but what I want to call attention to are a couple of the terms, and again, the words, the grammar, and the narrative. As he worked, he noticed a row of glass jars of huckleberries that I had canned. His grave face brightened. "Now that's the way to live," he said. "All the good things we got here in Florida, blueberries and blackberries and beans and cowpeas, all them things that ought to be canned and put up on a clean cupboard shelf with white paper on it. That's the way my ma did. She lived fine, not the way you live. But just as good when it comes to canning things and keeping things clean." His face darkened. "I've tried. And I've done tried to get my wife to do it that way, but it just ain't no use. One time I bought 24 glass jars, and I went out by myself, and I picked about a bushel of blackberries. And I went to the store and bought a 25-pound sack of sugar, and I taken it home, and I said, 'Wife, here's a bait of blackberries to put up for us and jam and jelly for the winter.'" He hesitated, his loyalty pricking him. "She probably didn't have time to do it," I suggested. "She had time. She let the blackberries spoil, and the ants has gotten the sugar, and I found the jars throwed out in the backyard." Now, what we have here is, it seems to me, a narrative that is as much about language as it is about marriage. That here, the man is complaining how he went out and got all these blackberries, and he got all these glass jars, and he hoped that his wife would can them and preserve them, and she didn't. What's going on technically in this passage? Just as we saw canebrake and physic, so I want to focus on answers here. The answers got in the sugar. You have the, again, regionalism of the past tense, throwed out in the backyard. You have elisions in regional speech. You have the use of o for of. You have bait. You have large amount. You have all of these issues that come together to evoke not just a particular region, but, if you like, the very idea of regionalism. But I want to pause now, and I want to call attention to some things that so many of these passages have in common. And that is that I think these are really stories about the place of the regional in American literary culture. Let me ask it this way. Is dialect comparable to answers in the sugar? Is the American language the sugar of our lives? And is dialect something which is like a set of ants that get in and infect it? By contrast, is the study of language like putting up blackberries, where we go out and we collect all of the varieties, and then I, as a teacher, bring in my pristine, sterile glass jars to preserve these berries for your delectation? And yet, what's happened in the end? The blackberries spoiled, the ants has gotten the sugar, the jars were thrown out in the backyard. As Samuel Johnson said, to try to record or fix a language is like trying to lash the wind. To enchain a syllable is like trying to lash the wind. And we saw how the Mississippi River, in Noah Webster, in Mark Twain, in Joel Chandler Harris, stands as an emblem of language itself constantly flowing, constantly changing, constantly mutating. The English language in these passages is something that is being represented, being evoked, if you like, through I dialect and special spellings. But what I think so many writers on dialect have recognized, and what so many of the writers that I've quoted from have recognized as well, is that we may try to, if you like, put up dialect in the glass jars of our lexicons. We may go out one night and smooch a gaudy big grindstone of the regional. We may wish at some moment to tell a story, and the physic comes upon us and breaks in. That is, it's no accident that physic is an ailment that has to do with breath, an ailment that has to do with the sound of speech. And so when we think about regional dialect, when we think about the ways in which America is a nation of areas and classes, regions, social, ethnic, and linguistic strata, we need to ask ourselves if the sugar of our tongue has been tainted by the answers, or if in fact what really makes Americans so tasty are those blackberries in the glass jars of our imagination.